today. We will have the last portion of our subject. As I said, the last 3 chapters of the book, Scaffolds of the Church. We will discuss ministry, how the patterns of ministry affect the way how the church perceives itself, how the church perceives its borders, how the church is open, because the openness of the church depends on how ministry is exercised and how ministry is received by communities. And we will also talk about the abuses of different structures of the church and how those abuses can be addressed. So that will be the subject of our conversation today. What will help us to understand ministry better is the distinction between the nature and the structures of the church that we have discussed already several times. And I'd like to ask you, how do you perceive the difference between the nature and the structures of the church? Who can tell us? What is the difference? Yes, please.
I think it goes back to like discipleship versus fellowship, and that discipleship is like the more natural form, right? So the nature of the church is obviously a more like organic form of the first gathering of people.
Yeah.
And with the structure of the church, that's when Jesus departs from the earth, and we have to like either become Christ-centric or ecclesia-centric.
Right. Yes, we can add to this. This is correct. But needs more explanations. Yeah.
The nature of the church is like invariable, so
Correct.
It's static and like faith and sacraments, and then the structure, it changes and it was added.
Correct.
And it's like dynamic versus not.
Static, not dynamic, not changeable. That's very correct. Yes. Nature is what the church is per se. What the church ever was. How it was established by God, how the church exists as a both human and divine institution. And the structures are those facilities that the church developed in order to sustain itself throughout the centuries. So structures are essentially there like scaffolds around an edifice, around the building, that help building an edifice, a house, and sustain it. So the role of the structures is supplementary. They are helpful, but they are not a part of the church. They are not a part of the nature of the church. And sometimes they can actually go against the church, against the nature of the church. And that's why they can be criticized. Hence is a possibility of critiquing the church. When, at least from the theological perspective, when people do criticize the church, they should do it. They should address their criticism to the nature and to the structures. And the structures are really in need of such critiquing, because the criticism helps them to improve, to be restored. So ministry can be interpreted, can be translated into these two terms, into these two categories of nature and structures. Indeed, ministry belongs to both the nature and the structures of the church. There are some aspects of ministry which are pertinent to the nature of the church, and there are some aspects of ministry which belong solely to the structures of the church, that can be interpreted as structures of the church, and therefore can be criticized, can be approached with a critical eye. Therefore, ministry, we can also say that ministry is both unchangeable and changeable. There is something about ministry that never changed, that belongs to the core of ministry. And there are some aspects of ministry that change. we said also that, and the nature of the church is something that existed always in the church. It is something that if you deprive of the church, then the church ceases to be the church. Then it is not anymore the church. And structures is something that if you deprive the church of structures, then the church continues to be a church. It doesn't decrease, it doesn't reduce the church to something which is smaller than the church. So it's with the ministry. Ministry always existed in the church, and the prototype of ministry is Jesus Christ himself, who was the first minister in the church and who set an example of ministry for the church. Therefore, and he made, Jesus himself made ministry pertinent to the nature of the church, an important aspect, feature of the church. Without it, the church cannot exist. However, the forms in which ministry is exercised vary. They were different from time to time, and as such, the forms of ministry belong to the structures of the church. And we'll come to that in a few minutes. So the principle of ministry is pertinent to the nature of the church from its very beginning. Also, ministry is not an abstract idea. Ministry is something concrete and real, and it is real because it belongs to a community. The real thing of the church is community, and ministry is a part of a community. Ministry is applied, is exercised within a community, and ministry, the purpose of ministry is the community as such. Ministry exists because of the community, for the sake of the community, and it stems from the community. Ministry as a part of the nature of the church has a feature of serving, of being a servant, a serving facility of the church. It is in the nature of ministry to serve others, to serve the community, and not to be served. When some structures of the church which carry out ministry turn, instead of serving institutions, to the institutions which are served, they abuse ministry, the idea of ministry. Okay? So the proper way for ministry to function is to serve. This function is encoded in the very word of ministry. To minister is to serve. And when this code is violated, when instead of serving, ministry becomes an object of service from the church, from the community, it becomes abusive. Ministry emerged in the church as a serving facility. In this sense, ministry was, from the very beginning, countercultural to the environment in which the church emerged. Remember, we discussed many times that the Christian church emerged in the context of the Roman world, which was very important for shaping the church. And the church sometimes adopted some elements of the Roman world and sometimes resisted those elements. At the very beginning of its existence, the church resisted the idea that those who are in the public service are to be served. That was the idea of the Roman service. So people who were in high political positions, they were regarded as, as lords, as someone who had to be served by others. The idea of public service as we have it now, well, theoretically at least, that those people who are in power are supposed to serve others instead of being served, was aligned to the Roman world. And the church actually introduced a completely new understanding of ministry, of service, which is not selfish, which does not demand in return, rewards, power, money, influence, and so forth, everything that the officials in the Roman world enjoyed and had. And had it, well, they were supposed to have them. Everyone would agree that they had to be treated as lords when they provided some public service. So the church essentially renewed, the Christianity, when it emerged, it renewed the idea of office, of ministry, of public service for the Roman world. Well, it should be said that it didn't continue for a too long time. Eventually, the two logics, the Roman and the Christian, they merged together, and the Christian logic of service was compromised. It turned to to be closer to the Roman pattern of being served instead of serving. But initially, again, Christianity was, in this sense, a countercultural phenomenon, because it opposed, it resisted the dominating pattern of service as it existed in the Roman world. Does it make sense, guys? To you? And we should say also another thing about ministry as the nature of the church, that its feature is not just to be serving, but also to be accountable. Accountability is another important feature of ministry. And accountability goes to the community. Community is the source and is the purpose of ministry, and it is also the reference point to which ministry accounts, to which it gives its account. Again, there could be, and there were indeed, abuses of accountability of ministry, because sometimes ministry remained accountable, but not to the community, but remained accountable, say, to the political authorities, to the emperors, to the political figures. Also, it is often, even now, it happens often even now, that ministry of the lower levels is accountable to those who are on the upper level of the church hierarchy. Instead of giving account to the community, they give account to those who are superior to them. Okay? So ministry as accountability is also a pertinent feature of the church. It should be there. And now, when it comes to the structures of the church, the structures of the church function differently. They are facilities that the church developed to accomplish its mission, to function according to its nature. And the structures of the church are supposed to help the church to be correspondent to its own nature. It doesn't happen always like that. And sometimes structures turn against the church. And they impede, instead of facilitate, they impede the church to accomplish its mission and its ministry. And ministry as a structure, not as a nature of the church, is a part of this problem sometimes. It can be also a part of the solution of the problem of abuses of the structures of the church, but it can also be a part of the problem. I'm sorry, it's not quite visible. I will read it. explain it to you. The church developed some structures based on its ministry to facilitate ministry. And we can identify several structures of this sort. First is, for instance, hierarchy. We have discussed hierarchy with you. Who can explain me what is hierarchy? You made so difficult presentations about hierarchy. I hope you could summarize what you learned. So what is hierarchy?
Chain of command, who's chain of command,
Correct.
down
Yes.
the pyramid,
Yeah.
and
That's correct.
Pope, all the way down, bishops,
Yeah.
right?
Correct. Yeah. Correct. And this principle is universally applicable. It applies to every domain of human activity. People create hierarchies for themselves, sometimes from scratch. That is the tendency of human beings. Because hierarchies indeed help people to organize themselves, to organize their work, to make the work done, to create functional systems. You cannot organize your work, you cannot organize modern human society without hierarchy. That's true. However, the perception of hierarchy could be different. Some people believe that hierarchy is something which is from God, which comes from God. And this idea is encoded in the very word hierarchy. Who knows the meaning of the word hierarchy? Where does it come from? I was saying hierarchy.
Yeah, so like ENLs, which
Hmm?
so it comes from ENLs, which means like sacred.
Yeah, yours.
So in a
Anarchy?
sense, sorry,
And Aki.
which is like it has like two things: the beginning, but also the order of things.
Yeah, principle.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a sacred order. That is an order of beings, of things, which has been established by God. That was the belief of many people until recently. So the hierarchies in of the power structures until recently was perceived as a sacred order, which cannot be touched, challenged by human beings. So when, for instance, this country was established, it was essentially a revolt against the divine order, which the kings of England represented. Because kings of England had an idea that they are on the top of the human hierarchy because they're installed there by God. And everyone who revolts, who tries to challenge this order, challenges God. Okay? Therefore, the founders of the United States, essentially, from the perspective of that time, from the political theories of that time, were challenging the divine order of things. It was not just about challenging the empire. Okay? Which was a very bold thing at the time. As a matter of fact, they are non-conformist background, that many of them came from the Puritan background. And for Puritans, the kings of England were nothing. They did not belong to the divine order. And that helped the founders of the United States actually to challenge the rule of the kings. And some other fathers were just secularly in the divine order. And that was a new thing at the time. Okay, so that's hierarchy. And hierarchy used to be extremely important in the political culture of Europe, of the West, of the East, of every culture until recently. It is still important for some societies. If you go to, for instance, to North Korea, you'll find the fullest incarnation of the idea of hierarchy of those who are in power. So there is a very strict hierarchy in the North Korean society, and this little guy Kim, he is on the top of that hierarchy, and everyone believes absolutely in religious way that that is a sort of divine order. They perceive their political system as something divine, as something given from God. And actually, he acts in a capacity of God. They have this idea that their leaders, they don't believe that the leaders die. That's why they, build mausoleums where they place their leaders. And for them, they are alive because they are like deities. And the small guy is a deity for them as well. Therefore, everything that comes from him is like coming from God, and they perceive the political order of the country as the absolutely sacred hierarchy. Everyone who wants to challenge it is sacrilegious. Okay? That's how the world existed until recently. Almost every country believed about itself, about its political structures like that. Even more, this was the case in the church. The structures, the hierarchical structures in the church were perceived as something which comes from God, and still it is perceived as like that. In the Catholic Church, well, the role of the Pope is divine. It's a divine office which cannot be challenged by human beings. Okay? And essentially hierarchy became a superstructure which engulfed all other structures within the church, which still orders all other structures of the church. However, if we study it historically, we'll find out that it comes not probably from God, but it comes from other institutions or environments. The first source of hierarchical thinking and order within the church was the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was essentially, fundamentally hierarchical. The Romans believed that their empire has order and that order is divine. And they, just like North Koreans, believed that their emperors were deities. And they literally venerated them as deities, sometimes when they were alive, sometimes and more often when they died. As I explained to you, if you go to Rome and you'll go to the Imperial Forum there in the center of the city, you still find altars dedicated to emperors who were venerated as deities. And so emperors were on the top of the hierarchy of the Roman society, and everyone else below them was incorporated to this hierarchy. Okay? So the order was divine. It was venerated. Everyone who wanted to challenge that order was punished. It was just like in North Korea. Well, they didn't have cannons to execute those people, but they just beheaded those people or crucified them. And essentially, Jesus Christ, he was crucified also because he challenged, among other things, because he challenged that order. So Roman Empire was the main source of this hierarchical thinking. And as far as the church integrated closer, deeper to the body of the Roman society, it adopted this hierarchical thinking. Another source that helped the church to embark on the hierarchical thinking was Neoplatonic philosophy. We have discussed already Neoplatonic philosophy. You can tell me a few words about it. What do you remember about Neoplatonism? look at your notes if you want. So what is Neoplatonism? Some of you explained to us nicely previously what is that. Can you repeat? Okay, a few words. I don't need you to explain it in detail. Please.
It's part of the nature of the church, and it's rooted in the philosophy of Plato,
Uh-huh.
and that it was developed as a school of thought in the Roman Empire.
Correct. Yes. Yes. It is based on Platonism. Do you remember at least one feature of this doctrine, of this philosophical system? Which used to be dominant through centuries. Yes.
The fact that, like, Plato, he invented the idea of the archetype,
Correct.
and that, like, ideas exist as things in this world, and the world is a copy
Correct. Yes.
of this world and its ideas. So
Uh-huh.
it's kind of like interrelated and kind of like recycling the ideas.
Correct. Yes. Yes, that's correct. Yes. So Neoplatonism was based on the idea that this world is just a shadow of the real world of ideas. The world of ideas is much more real than this world, even though it seems to be the opposite for us. What Neoplatonism added to Platonic philosophy was the principle of hierarchy. That was a Neoplatonic addition to the original Platonism. Well, Plato was also thinking in hierarchical terms somehow, but not to the same extent as the Neoplatonic philosophers did. Neoplatonic philosophers, many of them, they were Christian Neoplatonic philosophers. But the philosophy as such was produced by pagan philosophers who believed in many gods, who were polytheists, right? And they ordered those gods in the hierarchical structures. They believed that gods in whom they believe, they are structured hierarchically. And hence is the order of this world, which is, remember, a shadow of that world. And all those shadows, hierarchical shadows, apply to this world. And whatever we have in this world as hierarchy is just a reflection of the divine hierarchy for them. And therefore this hierarchy of this world is sacred. It is hiera. It's sacred. What hieros, which is at the root of the world hierarchy, means sacred. So this idea, Neoplatonic idea, added to the perception of the church orders, of the church structures as hierarchical. It was introduced to the church through the Christian Neoplatonists, philosophers who studied Neoplatonic philosophy, but they were Christians. And they produced their own justification for the hierarchy in the church. Of course, they could not believe in many gods. They were Christians and they believed in one God. But they extrapolated this Neoplatonic idea of the hierarchical structures of God to the divine being. What helped to them was the idea of angels. That God created angels as bodiless spirits, and God placed those angelic orders into a hierarchy. So there is God who is on top of that hierarchy, and then all those bodiless spirits who also constitute hierarchy. Archangels, seraphims, cherubims, and so forth. All those ranks, they are hierarchical. For the Neoplatonic thinking, it was essential to believe not just in angels, but also in their order. That there are superior angels and there are inferior angels. And as far as there are superior and inferior angels, they constitute a hierarchical structure. And that structure constitutes a prototype for the earthly structures, both political and ecclesial structures. So all the political order which exists in the human society and in the states, it comes from the angelic orders. That was the mentality of the medieval and antique political philosophy. That's how people in the Middle Ages perceived statehood, perceived political systems. It is hierarchical, and its hierarchy stems from God, from this divine order, which was elaborated through Christian Neoplatonism, which was taken through Christian Neoplatonism from pagan Neoplatonic philosophy into the church. It even structured the orders of the church. So not just political structures were built according to this pattern of hierarchy, but also ecclesial structures were ordered in accordance with that. Is it clear? Does it make sense to you? Any question? So that's where we are. We are talking about the influences, the sources of the hierarchical thinking in the church. One is the Roman political culture, and the other one is Neoplatonism. So hierarchy does not come from God, from Jesus Christ. It was not established by Jesus Christ. On the contrast, Jesus Christ actually reversed all the hierarchies. He was supposed to be the most important figure among the people of the time, and he chose to be the least important, the least significant figure. That was his reversal of hierarchies of the time. And the hierarchical structures that were built later, they sometimes go against the initial logics of Jesus. And that's how, and that's why the hierarchies that we have now, they are not divine institutions, but they come from different other sources. Still, they are useful. As we said, hierarchies, we cannot live without hierarchies because otherwise we will have chaos, we will have disorder. Hierarchies were adopted by the church for some good reasons, especially when the church was growing, expanding. The church from initial tiny group of people, Christians, who were really insignificant, became a huge structure which covered the entire empire and went beyond it. And that structure had to be structured, had to be ordered. The relations between communities had to be established and maintained. That's how hierarchical structures were adopted to help those structures. But we should remember that those structures were not like divine institutions. Later on, and nowadays, even now, people perceive still those structures as divine institutions. But historically, they emerged because the church needed it for its historical purposes, for its convenience, not as something sent from God. Do you see the difference between two perceptions of hierarchy? One, when it is perceived as something untouchable, as a divine institution, and the other one, when it is perceived just as a convenience, which was introduced for historical purposes to facilitate the mission of the church. Okay? That's why we say, and you see here on the picture, that hierarchical structures do not belong to the nature of the church, but those structures belong to the structures, to those scaffolds that surround the edifice of the church and that help maintain the building of the church. Okay? Now we continue with ministry, and we should say that we should repeat that ministry belongs to the nature of the church. Ministry always was a part of the church. Ministry was established, was introduced by Jesus Christ, and it is essentially important for the church. However, the forms in which ministry was exercised varied, it changed. New forms were introduced and older forms were abolished. That's how ministry, the forms of ministry, you can say, are a part of the structures of the church. Those helpful scaffolds, again. The Catholic Church nowadays and the Orthodox churches believe that some forms of ministry never changed. Like, for instance, the Catholic Church believes that there was always a pope in the church, there were always bishops, priests, and deacons in the church. Deacons are probably the least important in this hierarchy. The Orthodox Church believes that there were always bishops, priests, and deacons. Well, it seems that this perception is not historically correct, because there were times when there were no popes, no bishops, no priests, and no deacons. There were different other ministries. Actually, ministries were there were much more ministries in the very beginning of the church than those offices that we know now. They emerged like they mushroomed, actually, when the church began developing. You can compare the birth of the church with Big Bang. That when the initial kind of point exploded with huge energy, and all those pieces of tremendous energy just threw away to different sides, and that's how, and then how eventually that that piece of energy, of extreme energy, developed into modern universe. So the science says, at least. The church developed approximately in the same way. It exploded first. The first movement exploded just like the universe, and initially was formless, was just a piece of energy. And then that piece of energy developed into different structures, including those structures that we know now, like the popes, bishops, priests, and so forth. And initially, just as there were much more diversity within that small but very intensive piece of energy in the Big Bang. So the science says, the theoretical physics says that you could not distinguish the relationships, the particles that we know now. There were more variety of particles and relationships between them. at the time. So there were more offices and more facilities in the church, more charismatic kind of gifts in the church, and many people could have them, could exercise them. Actually, a lot of people acted in the capacity of what now popes, bishops, and priests act. But they were not, elected as popes, bishops, or priests. So it was really an unordered phenomenon. And later on, it became more ordered. It became more structured. That's what the sociologists call the routinization of charism. Sociologists which studied such religious groups as social phenomena, they have observed that social groups, those religious groups, they first emerge out of charisma as that big bang, as it were. And then what happens with charisma, it becomes routinized, it becomes a routine. And as a result of this process of routinization of charism, different structures emerge. They become more ordered. They become fewer. And they become more powerful. More power, more authority is concentrated in one pair of hands as a result of routinization of charism. That's how modern offices in the church emerged, as a result of routinization of charism as a part of the social process which can be applied to the church. That's how the modern offices emerge. Let us begin with the office of deacons, which is actually the oldest one and probably the most venerable one at the time. I'm sorry, you can't see it well. I will explain it. So deacons, what have you heard about deacons? Who are they? In your communities, you may have deacons, or you may have heard of them. Who are deacons? Yeah.
In my community, the Catholic community, a deacon is below a priest, so
Right.
they're so ordained, but they don't have the ability to
They don't.
consecrate Mass.
Yes, they don't. They help to celebrate Mass, but they don't perform the Mass. They cannot. Deacons cannot do the sacraments. They help doing the sacraments, but they don't do them themselves. The same is in the Orthodox Church. But effectively, deacons were the most ancient institution in the church. They were those who took care of all material side of the church. They took care of charitable work of the church. They took care of distributing money, food among the members of the community. They took care about maintaining the churches. So everything which is relevant to the existence of the church as a building, as a community, as its charitable works was a responsibility of deacons at the time. With the passage of time, those responsibilities were reduced just to helping a priest in the Mass. And it's interesting that, in the Catholic Church, deacons can be only men. In the Christian East, there were also female deacons, and they are being reintroduced now in the Orthodox Church. So it's a very recent process, very recent discussions, and in some churches, particularly in Africa, in the Patriarchate of Alexandria, we have now a tendency to appoint diaconesses, female deacons, to help in the church, which is a very new and still a very old. It's just a reintroduction of the old habit that existed in the church. speaking about the female clergy. Okay. So that's about deacons. As you can see, diakonia, which is service, the Greek word diakonia means service, which was bestowed upon deacons, is an ancient phenomenon, and it always existed in the church. We can speak about diakonia as a feature of the nature of the church, but people who performed this diakonia service, their offices varied. Once upon a time, there were deacons who did this, and now we have only the reminiscence of their service in the past in their name, deacons. They don't do the same job nowadays in the churches. And therefore, the institution of deacons is a part of the, as we know it now, is a part of the structures of the church because it changed. It was not invariable. Unlike diakonia, the service per se, which is an important part of the nature of the church. Okay, does it make sense? Now we come to the priests, to the presbyters. The office of presbyter, which we also know as priests nowadays, or in the Protestant churches they are called also pastors. This office was shaped by external influences as well, particularly by the Jewish and the Greek influences. There was an institution in the Jewish communities which was called Zekenim. They were like people in charge of the synagogue, or the place where Jews gathered together to pray. So those Zekenim were people who organized the worship of the community. They paid taxes, they received taxes, they managed all the matters of the synagogue. In some sense, they were similar to ancient deacons, but they were also, it's interesting that they were ordained by laying upon them hands. What has been introduced later on to the Christian church as hierotony, as laying down the hands, the way how orders are ordained in the church. So it comes from the Jewish tradition of laying hands upon one's head. At the same time, there was an institution of presbytery in ancient Greece. Presbytery, or presbyters, were members of ecclesia in ancient Greece. Members of ecclesia, as remember, a parliament of an ancient Greek polis, city, which was a political institution, and people who managed the matters of ecclesia were called presbyters. Remember, the members of the church were all the free male adult citizens of a city. And they decided about the matters of the city. And there were some elders, some more senior among them, and they were called presbyters. So this structure was adopted by the church. So everyone was equal in the church, just like the members of the ecclesia in Greece. But there were some senior members of the community who were called presbyters. And they managed the matters of the church, ecclesia. We still don't know exactly what was the function of presbyters and how this institution functioned in the ancient church. Later on, it certainly developed to the modern priesthood or pastorhood, to modern priests and pastors. But at that time, it's difficult still to say what was exactly their function. They were, in some capacities, they were similar to modern bishops. They were the most important figures in the church. And actually, bishops were elected among presbyters as in rotas. So there were presbyters in the community, and then people elected some of them to be as a senior presbyter, and that senior presbyter was called a bishop. And then he could serve as a bishop for 1 year, for 2 years, and then another guy would be elected instead of him. The job of the bishop was described by its name. The original Greek name means episkopos. From the word to overview, to supervise. They were essentially supervisors, overviewers of the community, of the matters of the community. That was the job of a bishop. They had some responsibilities, particularly to overview charismata within the community. Remember, everyone could exercise charisma, exercise a gift of the Spirit in a community. And those gifts, those exercises, those functions within the community were somehow moderated by that bishop. Eventually, because there were so many overlapping charismata gifts, and there was no much order in the communities. Communities sometimes became disordered because everyone tried to exercise the charisma. The role of the moderator, of the bishop, episkopos, increased, and eventually bishops accumulated all power in their own hands. That's how what they call now monoepiscopacy emerged. The rule of bishop in the church. That the bishop is the boss in the church. That was a result of the evolution within the community, of the evolution of offices within the community. This happened approximately in the second half of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd century. In different places it developed, evolved in different way and with different paths. And now what we have in the church, we have, well, in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox churches, we have the rule of monoepiscopacy, when all the power is concentrated in one pair of hands of the bishop. From a supervisor of charismata, a bishop turned to a holder of charismata and distributor of charismata. Okay? That was the change that occurred to this office. Does it make sense to you? Okay. Initially, bishops were supposed to supervise a particular community. But as communities developed, as they evolved as a structure, and as supracommunal structures became supervising communities, bishops became those figures in the supracommunal structures who exercised the supervision. Bishops from serving a particular community turned to serving supracommunal structures, the structures that bridge several communities, a territory. Remember how the church switched from the community-based, community-focused to the territory-focused structure. And bishops began supervising not just a community, but a territory with a number of communities on that territory. Okay. That was another step, iteration in the evolution of this office. And supracommunal structures, because they emerged as a result of the evolution of the church, they don't belong to the nature of the church, they belong to the structures of the church. What we now call dioceses in the church, in the Catholic Church, for instance, they are a part of the structures of the church, not the nature of the church. Okay? We were also talking about accountability as pertinent to the nature of the church, that it is important for the church, for ministry of the church to give account to the community. However, historical forms of accountability were different. The earliest form of accountability is that the church elected its own ministers, all of them. It means presbyters and bishops, everyone was elected. So people came together and voted for a person. And then, after a person, among several candidates sometimes, was voted, they laid down their hands on him and made him a bishop or a presbyter. This custom continued longer in the West than in the East. And this custom continued in the West approximately to the early Middle Ages, when there were reports that people still elected their bishops. In the East, it stopped early because of the influence of the empire was stronger in the East than in the West. There were good and bad reasons for substitution of this custom of electing a bishop with the custom of appointing bishops and presbyters. The difference, you probably see the difference. When I elect someone, a community elects someone, the person comes from the community. When the person is appointed, it means that someone who is above places that person to serve a community without consulting the community, and the community has just to accept the person. That was another custom that substituted the election of bishops and ministers in the community, approximately in the end of late antiquity, beginning of Middle Ages, and continues even now in the Catholic Church and in the Orthodox churches. The principle of appointment functions like an English club, that people are invited there. They go there by invitation. They cannot go there just on their own. So a collegium of bishops elect their colleagues, and those bishops who are elected by the other bishops, they are just imposed upon communities. That's how it functions in the Orthodox Church. In the Catholic Church, it's up to the Pope. The Pope, as the superior of the Church, appoints out that you will be a bishop, and then, well, actually, the Catholic Church, they suggest several candidates from the bottom level, and then the Pope chooses and approves that candidate. But still, it's a sort of combination of election and appointment. And it doesn't function without appointments, so the last word goes to the Pope. So there were positive and negative sides of both practices. No one practice is ideal. The positive side of electing is obvious. It increases accountability of that person to the community. The negative side is populism, which existed already at that time. That people liked someone, or a person wanted to be liked by people. He behaved like a populist politician nowadays, and he was elected, and not necessarily was the best one, the best choice. The second thing was the violence. Sometimes the elections of bishops were so important for a city that people just struggled like in a political struggle. They wrestled with each other like in a political struggle. They poured to the streets, they shouted in the streets, they were beating each other, they even killed each other sometimes in the struggles over election of bishops. And sometimes, therefore, the church had to contain these manifestations of democracy. Remember, this was an interesting time, because in the political offices, people were not elected in the Roman Empire. They were appointed. The principle of the Roman bureaucracy was by appointment only, like English clubs, not by election. There was no democracy in the society. Democracy existed only in the church, and the church elected its own bishops at the time. Another negative side of electing bishops by lay people was that they were elected sometimes by VIPs. So there were lay people, but with political and financial influence, power, and they imposed their will, and they elected whom they wanted, and the voice of other ordinary people was not heard. That was another problem of election, and that's why that was another reason why the church eventually switched to electing its own bishops by the body of bishops, not by influential VIPs. Yeah.
When did they make that switch?
Yes, in the West, approximately 7th, 8th century. In the East, approximately 5th, 6th century. It varied in different places. Different places was different custom. That's how we pass to abuses of the church. We have already discussed some of them, and we need to say more about them. So, and this. Abuses of the structures of the church. Again, I will explain to you. It's not very well visible. So the abuses of the structures of the church, like the ones that we've mentioned, they were caused by several reasons. One of them is ecclesiocentric tendencies within the church. The tendency of making the church a self-sufficient institution, autarkic institution, serving its own ends instead of serving the people of God and instead of serving Jesus Christ. Ecclesiocentrism is just the opposite to Christocentrism, to the perception of the church as centered around the figure of Jesus Christ. Ecclesiocentrism is the church centered around itself, and it created preconditions for abuses of the structures of the church. The second precondition is a dualistic worldview, which was spread at that time. Remember, when people saw the world in black and white, when they saw that evil can be substantial, that you can touch, you can feel evil incarnated in other people, in places, and as evil could be incarnated in people or places, stones, trees, countries, mountains. That was a widely spread perception at the time. So good could be incarnated. And people came to believe that good can be incarnated in the structures of the church. The structures of the church, like bishops, for instance, they are the incarnation of good. They are the substance of good. And if you perceive the structures of the church uncritically in this way, those structures become misbehaving. They abuse their status. Something that you venerate, and it is not really a subject of veneration in effect, can turn, well, abusive. That's how when this dualistic worldview ascribed or perceived the structures of the church as the ontological, as essential good, as opposite to the essential evil outside the church, those structures of the church began misbehaving, abusing. Does it make sense to you? It's a bit tricky to understand. So this dualistic worldview contributed to the abuses of the church's structures. As a result, the structures of the church began substituting community. Instead of serving communities, they demanded that communities would serve them, the structures. They subsumed communities to their own purposes, their own goals. And that was an abuse of community. There were several, we can identify several particular abuses of the church, like, for instance, sacerdotalism. It comes from the Latin word sacerdos, which means a priest. When pastors in the church turned to priests, the idea of priests, priests were an essential feature of the pagan world. There were many priests, and they were real priests at the time, in the sense that their task was to operate with the sacred things, to manage the sacred, and to provide people with access to the sacred. People could get access to the holy things, to divinity, to deity, only through priests. That was the job of priests. Okay? The idea of the Christian priesthood is different, because in Christianity there is abundance of grace. Grace cannot be managed, cannot be reduced by someone, cannot be organized to be accessed through someone. The task of a priest in the Christian church is different than the task of a priest in the pagan religion, for instance. The task of a priest is not to manage access to the divine, but to help people to realize the abundance of grace, to immerse to the abundance of grace. However, in the Christian church, it often happened that the priests turned, the ministers of the church turned to the priests in the pagan sense of managers of the access to the divine, which was a kind of compromise with the Roman idea of priesthood and an abuse of the structures of the church. This also, the abuses also affected the way how people identify themselves. If I am a priest, as a priest, I regulate to what extent other people can get access to the divine. This makes me special. This makes me a kind of exempted from the rest of the people. This makes me thinking that I'm identical with the church per se. This makes me considering myself as unlike the rest of the Christians. That's how sacerdotalism introduced the idea of separation of clergy from laity, priests from lay people. Lay people, I assume that you know what lay people means, right? Non-ordained. Those who are just ordinary members of a community who don't have ordination to priesthood or to a bishop or to any clergy. So there are lay people and clergy. And there is a distance between them which emerges out of that. And this distance is actually an abuse of the structures of the church, because it creates false identities. When I identify myself as a priest with the church, and those people who are not priests, they are considered to be kind of secondary kind of members of the church, not by the members of the church. Also, remember, we should say about hierarchies as another name for this creation of distance between lay people and priests. Within the priestly order, its own hierarchy emerges between priests, bishops, and the pope. So what the sociologists of religion call the social distances become increasing in the church. That's a result of hierarchism. The increasing social social distances within the church leads to the stratification of the church. They lead to making members of the church citizens of different sorts of the church, as it were, citizens of the church of different sorts. Better members of the church and worse members of the church, superior members of the church and inferior members of the church. And that is certainly an abuse, because those are things that were designed as structures to facilitate, to unite people in the church. They actually separate them from each other. And that is certainly an abuse of the structures of the church. Okay? And we can call it hierarchies within the church. There is an abuse which does not occur in the Catholic Church, but it does occur in the Eastern churches, which is jurisdictionalism. Remember, I was explaining to you that the Eastern churches, they are divided into independent jurisdictions, to independent local churches. Those are also structures of the church. And because they are separated, the churches are separated by those jurisdictions, they sometimes fight against each other, trying to get some more jurisdiction, some more territory from another church. And that's another abuse of the structures of the church. This is jurisdiction is a rule of a bishop over a certain territory. So if another bishop interferes to my territory, this violates my jurisdiction. And I rebuke that bishop, and we begin fighting each other. And this fight is not helpful, and this is an abuse of the structure, which is called jurisdictionalism. Okay? So as I said, this does not happen in the Catholic Church, because the jurisdictions are moderated by the Pope, and that is the good role, a very positive side of one-man rule in the church, and it does happen in the Eastern churches very often. You can call those abuses as structure-centrism or institutionalism, when institutions are venerated more than the communities to which those institutions should serve. Okay? We have explained about the stratification, and now we should say a few words about we should say also about exclusivism. What does it mean? When we develop structures within the church that help us to sustain communities, to sustain all those networks of communities, we inevitably create instruments of distinguishing, instruments that structure them. Those instruments, they can be presented as a sort of internal walls. It's just like, like a family who lives in a flat, in an apartment. Every member of a family, each member of a family has his or her room, right? You don't live in one room, right? It's not helpful, right? That's why even though you love each other as a family, you need your own rooms to live there, right? The same is with the churches. Even though the members, the parts of the church, they like each other, they love each other, they need separate rooms for themselves, okay? It means that they have these internal walls that separate each other. Those walls can function in different ways. They can be useful and can be abusing. For instance, they are useful because they help members of the family to keep their privacy and to live comfortably without interfering with one another. On the one hand, if you have a quarrel in a family, you can just lock up in your room and don't allow anyone to enter, and that is not probably helpful use of these internal spaces and walls. So that is useful and abusing sides of these internal walls. However, what happens regarding in the church? The church, which became a huge structure, built a lot of internal walls that separated different sections of the church on different territories and different cultures. And the more the church built those internal structures, the more it has extrapolated those structures on its external border. So that the experience of internal structures of the church projected itself to the experience of the external border of the church. The more the church developed its internal structures, the higher were the borders, the walls that it built around itself, separating itself from the rest of the world. Hence is an equation, a sort of equation. The more you build internal structures, the higher are the walls around the church that you build around the church. And that's how the church, from the original universal phenomenon that spread, that expanded rapidly everywhere, turned to a locked inside entity that don't step out often, which remains closed inside itself, which remains a closed, a kind of ghettoized community. Okay, so that's in order if you want to make the church more universal, more open, you need to reconsider the internal structures of the church, because the internal structures contributed, the development of the internal structures contributed to the development of the external borders of the church. Does it make sense to you? Okay. Hence is the importance of the idea of the structures of the church for ecumenism, for the ecumenical openness of the church to other churches, to other communities. You can be open to other Christian groups if you are not obsessed, if you are not fixed upon your internal structures, if you are not obsessed sometimes with your internal structures, with building those internal walls and locking down within those internal walls. However, because as I said, the church developed those internal structures, it gradually also enhanced its external walls, and the perception of by the church of itself as from the universal kind of entity embracing the entire world turned to a local entity confined to a place. It turned to the idea which is similar to the modern idea of a state. The modern idea of a state is that the state has a border, okay? And that border is sacred. No one can violate that border. No one can intrude through that border. Take this country nowadays. That is exactly the mentality of the modern state. And this is not common just to the United States. It happens everywhere in Europe as well. So they enhance their borders. They enhance their security policies regarding borders. And the state that thus tries to preserve its own structures and its own sovereignty. That's what the church becomes nowadays as well. It becomes, it is more concerned about its own borders, preserving and safeguarding its own borders than about the spreading its mission and developing its mission everywhere. This idea substituted the original idea of Christianity as a universal phenomenon which did not have borders, but instead Christianity had frontiers. Frontiers as the place where we should expand all the time. We should go always beyond what we see. That was the idea of the church, and that's how the church functioned in the beginning. And this is a helpful still image for the church to overcome its divisions nowadays. And the last thing that I want to say in 5 minutes that remain about the solution of the problem of abuses. Because abuses affect the communities are also a solution to the abuses. Communities help to help the structures of the church to be restructured, to be helpful again. Communities constitute a criterion according to which the structures of the church should be reconstructed, should be revisited, reshaped. That was the initial rationale of the structures, the raison d'être of the churches, to help the communities. When the structures lose from their focus this rationale, when they lose community from their focus, then they become self-sufficient entities. They become ecclesiocentric and abusive. When they refocus again on community, they rebuild themselves. So the structures should be somehow reshaped according to their rationale of serving the community. The structure should also be reshaping according to their initial rationale idea. All the structures emerged for a good reason. The church invented them to help its own life, its own people, and from the beginning all the structures were good and had good reasons to exist. They became abusive only later on. In order to repair them, they need to be brought back to their original idea. That is another kind of way of repairing structures. Structures can also be abolished altogether because they are not sacred institutions. They are not, something divine. They can be just dropped out and abolished in the church. Or alternatively, they could be repaired according to the criteria that we just mentioned. So that's what I wanted to say you today about the structures of the church, and particularly the ministry of the church. Ministry can be abused, ministry can be abusive, and ministry can be repaired if a community is in its focus.